Welcome to the Think Fitness Life podcast, season 2, where we inform and empower people. My name is Matt Gluckman, and I started this podcast with two other expert coaches in the field, Eric Menchie and Mike Urso. Our mission is to explore all things related to mindset, exercise, nutrition, with an attention to detail and a skeptical curiosity that leaves no stone unturned. We are always here for you as health advisors to guide and steer you in the appropriate direction that best suits your needs and goals in your life. And to launch off season 2, our first episode, we all did a little bit of research and we're going to be discussing the state of the food industry, talking a little bit about the history, some of the politics behind it, our current state, and then leave you with some solutions and what to do moving forward. I'd like to get Mike to talk first a little bit, dive into some of the history. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. Well, where do we even start?
Well, we created fire.
Where it started. If we use the theme of like past, present, and future, I think would be the best place to start. You know, where did we start from when we were talking about the food industry itself? I mean, as you guys know, that up until the agricultural revolution started, which is they approximate it to be around 12,000 years ago. We were primarily hunter-gatherers and foragers. And so a couple things happened there. We kind of look at the population of people today, and there's a lot of people who, if we were to ask, you know, the average person on the street, hey, you can no longer go to the grocery store anymore, and you got to go out and find your food out in the wild. I would say a very tiny, small percentage of the population would be able to do that.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
Totally agree.
Yeah, and I think so because of that, you know, we look at like the human kind of like specialization has really become much more niche down in what we're capable of doing. But like back then, when people were hunter gatherers, when they were looking for food, they were really much more skilled. Like they had to know and be able to identify, you know, different types of foods, and they had to know how to hunt, and they had to know how to not pick poisonous berries, and so their skill set was much more broad. And you know, as we've gone into like modern times, it's really changed, you know, quite dramatically. You know what I mean?
100%. I mean, one of the things I first look at is variety. I mean, the people can eat chicken every day, every meal. People can eat beef every day, every meal. People can eat just broccoli every day, every meal. But it wasn't like that. You may
Well, and that's where part of it comes from, right? We switched over from being more hunter gatherers into more farmers, right? When that agricultural revolution had begun, the amounts and the different types of foods really were slimmed down. So there were less choices because there were only certain things that can thrive from a farming sense. And so wheat became extremely popular. And I forget what it was. There was a stat I read recently, but the amount today, because wheat, you know, really just grew in random places and people didn't really know what to do with it back then until they learned how to harvest it and farm it. But right now in current day, the amount of wheat on the planet that is grown on every continent in the world now, I guess, except for Antarctica, is essentially it would fill up the square mileage of the island of Great Britain, 10 Great Britons. So 10
Wow.
Great Britons essentially is how much wheat is around the entire world that can be harvested right now or is growing. And that was not like that, you know, even just 12,000 years ago. So it's really fascinating when you kind of look at, you know, where things spread. Now, one thing that's really interesting going through the research that I found was that when you look at the agricultural revolution, and this came up in several different accounts of history that I've read through, is that the agricultural revolution kind of sprung up independently in all different parts of the world. So it didn't just kind of spread like here and then these people taught people how to farm and then, you know, it moved to the next, you know, country or continent. It really just kind of it kind of populated in different areas at random times, which I thought was really fascinating. Um, I don't have a really great explanation for that, or even a theory on why that may be. I don't know if you guys
Lag time of
have any.
information being spread across the globe at that time. Not everybody had Twitter, probably.
Yeah, yeah, certainly,
But
so.
one thing that also is fascinating to me too, when I was looking at a lot of the research out there, was in terms of the human diet. If you put it on a football field, the
Yeah,
agricultural revolution aspect and wheat being introduced and grains being introduced more readily is less than a yard. So in the
mm,
bigger picture, we if you zoomed in on that yard in the last what do you say 1,200 years, 12
12,000.
or
Yeah,
12
thousand.
we've really gone overboard with the amount of, I mean, 10, like you said, 10 Great Britons and everything, with the amount of
Yeah.
wheat that we produce, consume, and f- utilize in our livestock.
Well, and yeah, think about it this way too, because wheat is very stubborn the way it grows. It doesn't like rocks. It doesn't like growing around other types of plants. So it really has to be nurtured. People have to be out there breaking their back, digging rocks out, digging weeds out, so that wheat can thrive. And something that's really interesting is that we all know that once the agricultural revolution started and we were able to farm our food, that it now allowed us to harvest more food and store more food. And because of that, the population started to increase. People weren't having to be as transient and move around as much. People can, set up their farm or their home in a certain area,
Right.
and they live off that certain area. So then the population would multiply at a much faster rate because of that. The food that they can store up would multiply at exponential rates because of that. And also, at first, what they said was, and this is really interesting. When I was doing the research, was that farming versus so the actual physical labor of farming versus hunter gatherers. So when you're doing hunter gathering, you're climbing, you're running, you're scaling, you may be chasing down, your hunt. You may be climbing trees to gather, whatever fruits or different vegetables or whatever you're looking for. And so the physical nature of hunter gatherers is very different from the backbreaking work that involves farming. And so, because of that, there were a lot of physical ailments and issues that have arisen because of the farming and agricultural revolution. More things like slip discs and broken bones, and
Interesting. That's pretty interesting.
yeah. So that was a really interesting thing that came out of my research with, which was those things didn't really exist because they and us as movement experts can really understand and respect the nature of the hunter gatherers three-dimensional and much more varied movement that has to happen throughout the day and how the body adapts to that. Well, the body then started adapting to the same specific movements, like digging a hoe into the ground and digging rocks out, or digging a trench. So all of these small little changes happen within our human population, and they just happened 12,000 years ago. We're talking 10,000 BC. Like, that's pretty wild when you think about it. How dramatically things have changed after being fairly the same, or very much the same for millions of years prior, hundreds of thousands of years prior to that in the human species.
Yeah, you almost wonder like what changed. Like, were people sick of walking around or just traveling this earth?
That's what it
Or
sounds
did
like.
they
You know what I mean?
or did they like reach the end of continents and space? Or they were like, well, what else is there? Like, can we keep going at a rate of like people are gonna die, they're not gonna survive? And they were like, hey, we'll pick the easy way out. Let's see this crop, let's eat it, make sure we don't die after we eat it, and then can we plant this seed? And I think like Mike said, it was that's where you see these big civilization and populations just stem out of like the Mayans, the Aztecs, China, the Middle East, like Roman empires, like, but they all had similar but different crops. And it's just everything in the world is different. But
Well, then, and once you begin to like enjoy these new luxuries, right, of having your food there on your farm as opposed to having to go out and get it, they tend to then become more of an expected thing, and then you start to count on them. And so I think that that changes your mentality over and your expectations over things too. So that, you know, that changes the mindset of the individual as well.
It's almost like the hunt and gather, just like it's done. It fell short. But I think if you kind of look at it, like what populations did it like stem through last? You know, you kind of hear
Hmm.
about like the Native Americans in this country back then, like they still had, you know, they still had their crops and stuff, but they were more like on the plains hunting, gathering bison and, you know, these elk that would last them months and feed a lot. And then you have like, you know, the Europeans come over and give more of a farming aspect. You almost wonder where it kind of, you know, fell to last. And if those
Yeah.
are those populations or civilizations, like were they underdeveloped or kind of just like beat out?
Well,
Yeah.
it's almost like it was a competition, and then colonizing became a dominant thing. So it was like a race to colonize, and then it was, and I do agree with your point about people being either like too smart for their own good as they developed and we figure things out, or you know a little lazy as well, like just tired of having to move every season and trying and finding new homes all the time and losing part of your village or your tribe all the time.
I mean, it
And
was smart at
Well,
the
it's,
time. It was
yeah,
sustainability. It's like,
absolutely,
hey,
absolutely. You can't blame them.
but at,
But
no,
but
we've
but then
at
taken
that
it
if
too
same
you
far.
then I guess if we're like going to highlight the problems with it all, then you fast forward it to even the past like 50, 100 years, you know, like the livestock and the products that we create are totally different in the past 100 years to now. And you know, you can look at rates of obesity, you can look at rates of how much we spend on healthcare, and you can look at rates of um, heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's, and it's insane when you look at it. And in any other industry or in any other like business, if you were looking at just the numbers on the amount of money that we spend on like healthcare, for example, and then the results of people's health, and then what we're putting into our bodies and what we're putting into our livestock and the way we're operating everything, you would totally readjust. You're like, this doesn't make sense. Nothing is working properly. We need to go back to the drawing board. We're having all these health ailments and maybe we need to reassess the way that we sort of mass agriculture or mass farm and mass raise chickens and cows and everything like that. And
yeah.
I
You
sorry,
know what's
I kind of sped ahead
No,
in
it's all good.
history.
no, yeah, I'll
We'll,
bring it
we'll
back here
jump.
because you know what's kind of weird about that too, about like all the rapid transformation of like the way our industry has evolved is, and I read, I don't know if you guys have read *Sapiens*, but it was a great book about the account of history of the hunter gatherer all the way up through present day, and some of the really interesting things when we look at like the psychology of the human, just you know 30,000 years ago, and evolutionary psychologists basically say that 30,000 years ago, even, you know, we all had as humans the same physical, emotional, and intellectual capabilities that we have
Huh.
today. And most of those psychological, of the human psychology that was developed, that we have in present day was actually developed before the period of the agricultural revolution. So even though things have changed and evolved to where they are today so rapidly over the last 10,000 years or 12,000 years, um, our mindset and our psychology is still built in as a hunter
Mm,
gatherer,
yeah.
right? That's still wired to us. And so this instinct that we have to gorge on these high calorie foods is still wired in our DNA because again, like we don't know when we may find another hunt,
Right.
right? Or we don't know when we may come across the next you know, bushel of berries that we just have to load up and stock up on. And you know, so there with these long periods, we've talked about this long periods of fasting, long periods of overfeeding. This is all stuff that our body is still essentially in that psychological and physiological. In other words, it has not adapted to the current state of where rapid transformation of where the industry has taken a turn to.
And I don't
Right.
think
No,
I
no,
don't think you're going to see a change because, like, you know, the way it's conditioned. Also look at, you know, the mind of that, but look at the system. Like our systems haven't really changed, so the brain's going to do that, and then the metabolic systems underneath are going to do the exact same thing. Like you said,
Well,
like fasting, if they're getting enough food. So, and I don't know if we're actually going to adapt to that and have this mindset like, hey, we don't have to worry about threat. So if we eat, we don't need to store that. I don't think, in my opinion, I don't think that will change because I think that's just hardwired into us because it's just survival in any animal it is.
but I think
Right.
another
Like it's
thing that's important
to us though.
to highlight, that I think Mike was trying to highlight, was just that the way that our psychology and our biochemistry makeup is such that it is set for survival. So, when you come across something and it lights up your dopamine receptors and gets you to eat it again and wants you to eat it again, well, nowadays we're in an environment where that stimulus is all around us. So we light up our dopamine system because we have something that is wheat based or sugar based or flour based, because that does go through our dopamine system. And then all of a sudden, everything we see and everywhere we go, those products are there. So we grab a soda, we grab a piece of bread when we're at the table, just sort of like out of habit, instinctually. And it's funny when you're working with a new client, and it's like they've become alive and they've become aware, and they've start to make the right choices. And all of a sudden, if you have someone who committed, in 30 days they can turn their life around because it's that easy. But it just takes a little bit of some cognitive effort and deliberate effort on your part to break the habit out of the animalistic instinct to grab for that piece of bread or grab for that piece of fruit every meal or grab for that dessert after every dinner, and say, no, I don't need that. That's not good for my system.
Right. And I think that's where
Yeah.
fasting is very beneficial, like psychologically, because you're basically telling
Right.
someone, hey, you don't have to eat, just go be in survival mode and your body will figure it out. Like you have
Oh,
to eat
100%.
eventually, but it's not
Yeah.
just restricting calories and all that stuff, which it is, but it's basically telling the human brain to figure out how to live without a surplus of food coming in. And the body is resilient and it will figure out for a while. And studies have shown that. And then when people eat again, you create this behavior of like, okay, I really don't need this, even though my body's like, hey, food, survival, I get it. But you're just going to take it back to its, we'll call it 12,000 year plus of, I don't have an animal that I can see that I can hunt and eat. We're going to have to wait till I find one.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
path of least resistance. It's like I almost envision, like, in the brain, like Jabba the Hutt sitting there, like, oh, should we burn some energy in our body, or do some extra work to, you know, add pyruvate to something and we can burn it for fuel? And it's like, nah, just go ahead and send signals to the brain that we want to eat. We'll grab something. You know what I mean? So it just
It's interesting too. Like, so we're talking about all this, like, ancient brain that we have, and all this hardwired stuff that is really in us, and how it's making these challenges in our present day life, where we do have such an abundance of things available, although we still have a scarcity kind of mindset, the way we approach eating a lot of times. Hence a lot of the obesity and people overfeeding. It's really interesting because I do think that even though we've gone through these like dark ages of like nutrition really spoiling, the human body, and all these diseases and all these things coming of it, I do feel like the pendulum has to swing back the other way at some point in time.
Yeah.
And I think that happens. This is my theory, is that we have all this information that can be shared because of the internet, and because we can Google anything at any moment and get the answers to that. I think the pendulum starts to swing back, because it's almost a gift and a curse to have the access to all this information. But as we learn more, and as we're able to do research and learn about our ancestry and learn about, evolutionary means, we can now start to understand and develop the owner's manual for this million-year-old brain. And that once we have the information to develop the owner's manual, because for the longest time, ancient foragers and all that, and hunter-gatherers, they had to figure all this stuff out, and they didn't really put any science to it. The fact that we have the science means that we can now start to develop an owner's manual for how this brain actually works, and we know it's an ancient brain. And from there, we're going to be even more empowered when we now can start taking action on some of those abilities that we are now able to develop. And now, like, it's almost like getting the cheat codes for your brain in a way, because we have this owner's manual that we're slowly developing, and that's only happening because of the massive sharing of information that we
But
have.
one thing that does happen that we have to be aware of when it comes down to the science is just natural human behavior to let ego get involved, and people want to, I don't know, be right. They want to propagate their research, their information, and you have issues like, the story of Dr. Burkett, who went to Africa to study colon cancer. And I don't necessarily think he was a bad guy by any means, but they didn't have colon cancer. He started studying their food and their diet, and they were eating a lot of like chicory and all this fibrous things, but he thought it was like they were eating barley and wheats and all this stuff. So he gets back to UK and he says, this is what we need to be eating. We need to be eating wheat. We need to be eating oats. We need to eat barley. And it was just a fork in the road to go the wrong direction. So it's super important to not only take everything with a grain of salt, but then also do your continued research. But one other point I want to make is like nowadays, or even the past couple 100 years, or just 100 years, with products and all this stuff coming out, and people like lying on about products, or lying to get past regulations, and they're putting their own needs first, sacrificing the greater good of humanity. And one of them was this Pam cooking spray that I learned about how they lied about it not having butane and propane in it, and sure enough it did. And there was a big lawsuit. I forget the guy's name who took him down. I want to say it was like Don Barrett or something, but I'll have to double check that. But then you get back into greed, right? Like everyone wants to be the first with all the chicken to the market. So now you're going to fatten up your animals with oats and corn, and you're going to use hormones to fatten them quicker, and you're going to use antibiotics to make sure you have a great yield of your product. And it's just like bigger, faster, stronger. Everyone's just this big rat race, and people are willing to take all these shortcuts and make all these quick decisions, and they're supported by a lot of evidence from scientific data. So, I just feel like in this day and age, you can find evidence to support any side to any argument on the internet.
Oh yeah.
So I think it's super important to always read further, always ask questions. But you just gotta be skeptical, because someone's pushing an agenda. Typically, someone's pushing something on you for a reason. And we've talked about this before. The devil's in the details. So yeah.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the antibiotics and all that grain stuff. And I sent this article to Mike. I don't think it was on the feed, or I didn't send it to you, Matt. But it was kind of interesting because they didn't really know what it was going to do, and they kind of stumbled upon it because like livestock was getting sick, and they were like, okay, how do we prevent certain things? And I'm not 100%, but it seemed that they use antibiotics to kind of treat the animals, but then showed that, it had different adverse effects for it. And then obviously as you get more, it becomes a problem now. And in the article, it said like, as it grows, these animals actually get, immune to the antibiotics they're giving them, and these new like pathogens are diving up. So you almost wonder, like the turn of the 20th century, when they were doing all this stuff, it was just like by trial and error, and they're like, hey, it sticks, let's roll with it. And now it's just, how can we use that to benefit and make more money? Because at the time,
I mean, we are definitely we're like a test generation for sure.
well, I think everything generation is, because think at the time, like, early
True.
1900s, there's starvation, they're depleted of nutrients. Like people are just thinking, how do I make these animals more efficient and fatter quick so we can feed more people and like say cure starvation? Nowadays, it's just, how can I put more meat on an animal to make more money per pound? And it's amazing how that like the pendulum just has shifted all the way to this end because everything's just so readily available. We can just make things better, bigger, and like more insane that was before when we get, outside of the sights of these forefathers who like invented this stuff. I was like, no, I just did it to like help the population. Now we're
Right.
like being a detriment to the population.
Consider this too. Like we talk about like cattle, like cows, bulls, wild cows, both before they were domesticated. They had to be out in the wild. They had to find food. They had to evade dangerous predators. They had to find mates. Reproduce, all that stuff. That kind of wild kind of way of living has changed quite dramatically when we domesticate these animals. So think about just what happens. We're all emotional beings, right? You can't tell me that these animals don't have feelings. There is something that's changing with these animals emotionally, right? When they start to become domesticated, they no longer have to communicate properly or look for food. And so, they become depressed, fat, overweight, just like humans do in a way.
No, 100%.
And so evolution and factory farming and large scale farming and domestication of these animals for livestock has really probably dramatically changed their just like, emotional, which in turn is going to change the quality of the food.
Yeah, think
right?
about the stress, all the stress that you're putting on that animal.
Absolutely.
And then you're just eating that.
Which is smart because like the more stress you put and then you feed the thing, we're talking thousands of calories, it's automatic weight gain.
Yeah.
And they don't care. I mean, they'll feed the thing, Skittles, whatever. Like it's not just like it's corn and soy and stuff, but like, you hear some things that they're just feeding these things just troughs of food that people don't want to eat or like the rejected candies, and it's just like, really? But it goes to show you like people don't really care that much. It's just how can you turn $1?
Right.
But cows are mammals, right?
Right.
I believe. So I mean, mammals is all about like motherly loving bonds and taking care of your offspring. Think about that. Like a cow has an offspring and then it's completely ripped away from them. Think about like they're innately programmed just like us as mammals to have that same sort of emotion. They've done studies where babies get taken away from their mothers and they just like they're both depressed. Like it's like you're changing nature. You're changing the way nature is supposed to exist, and you cannot tell me that does not affect the food or how that food might taste or how that animal's emotions are then changing. Just their own physiology.
But one thing that does play a role with the sort of development of where we are today is the disconnect between me and the actual animal, right? I mean,
Yes.
Like I have a few friends that are hunters and they have such a profound respect for animals and life. And when they take a life, they utilize every part of that animal in some way out of full on respect. And, I'm sure that meal tastes so different to them than it does me. But and then also, 9 times out of 10, I feel like people don't even think of an animal when they're in the grocery store. They just see fresh looking meat that looks fine to them, and they don't know any other thing to think about.
Right. And that's huge because, you ask people, people are vegetarian or vegan or whatever they want to be. And, they're asking, well, why do you eat meat? And some people just don't even have that disconnect of someone slaughtered this meat, kind of like gutted it and had to cut it up piece by piece. And, I think if a lot of people had to do that today, I mean, it's a tough thing to do. And
people would be eating more plants for sure.
Right. And I give credit for people who understand that. And I think it's a very good thing to learn because, you have to learn like what this animal is going through and, kind of where it's come from in the process, because it's not that easy. It's not like, the cow goes down from natural death and the steak goes onto the table like that. It doesn't work like
Right. There's
that.
a lot of stuff.
But then
There's
just some
suffering
people think they can
involved.
have filet mignon every single day, or they can have like the best
which you
cut
which you
of.
can. And I think that's also a problem because
I agree.
I eat the same thing every day, and I don't know if that's good, bad, or whatever it is. But if you look back to like the hunter gatherer, some of these people could be going without protein for you know weeks, days, months, and just eating grains and whatever they find, or they take a big mammal down and they have protein for months and they don't get any grains. And I think that can be a big correlation of, are we burning out our systems by eating like, oh, here's a lot of carbs, protein, and fats, where if there could be a diet where like, hey, I'm going to eat just maybe meat and some vegetables for a week, and then I'm going to go eat more carbs and no meat. I don't know the stats on that, but
Well, a couple things that are fascinating is there's a story about how after Vietnam we had a bunch of coconuts and we fed them to all these pigs, and the pigs started losing weight, so we didn't know what to do, so we fed them corn and soy to fatten them up again. And scientists will argue, and some scientists will say that eating fat will raise your cholesterol, and a lot of the data will actually show that eating cholesterol will actually do nothing to your actual serum cholesterol levels. So when you're talking about feeding an animal now, when we're feeding them just corn and soy and oats, you're absolutely raising their cholesterol and you're raising their fat on their body. And the way that it works on a biochemical level, and I don't know how it actually, like, all I can think is maybe the actual molecule itself gets augmented in some way, right? But when an animal is eating grass for its primary nutrients, like our cow, for example, eating plants, its interaction with the human body is an omega-3 fatty acid, and when you feed it corn and soy, the way that meat now interacts with our system is it's now an omega-6 fatty acid. So it goes from being good to being actually really bad for you. And there's a lot of articles on this on I think Dr. Gundry has some, Dr. Mercola has some, but we'll be sure to reference a lot of this stuff in the show notes for people. But
well, with a lot of times
little
with those kind of animals, so a lot of the like the cows, I'm not sure about pigs, but cows, I know deer, and some other maybe like goats and stuff, their stomach isn't built for digesting corn. It actually causes a bad reaction in their stomach and causes them to have a lot of gas and like GI issues. So
I mean, we're not designed to.
right. So think about an animal like that,
Yeah.
and when I'm out like hunting, I've read a lot of stuff, and people say you shouldn't like bait or put corn down for deer and stuff like that because it takes that and they eat it and it makes the meat a different quality meat if they rather than they just eat
Yeah.
regular vegetation. So then it's like, well, why are we even feeding that stuff in the first place if we know that it's not good for the cow's digestive system? There's no way you're going to get quality meat. So I mean, unless
Well,
it's
it's
truly
terrible. It's terrible for our digestive system. And then what
right.
happens is when we eat something that has been fed that, it in trace amounts, it gets into our digestive system and damages our gut and gets through our gut wall and can end up in our bloodstream. It can end up in our brain. And um, yeah,
Not
it just it just exponentially increases over time, right? When we blew up the agricultural revolution and we're wheat everywhere and corn everywhere and soy everywhere, and now what's the best way to get the best yield on your farm? Just pump your animals with
soy.
corn and soy and sugar and antibiotics and hormones, and yeah, and then all of a sudden now it's in our system. I mean, it's just kind of like what happened to the water supply
Yeah.
when we started. We at first we felt like, oh, the water's endless, we can dump mercury in the water, right? We did that for years. And then we said, oh, we need to stop doing that. Mercury's showing up in levels of wild caught fish. And now we have levels of plastic showing up in wild caught fish. I mean, we just constantly are tainting things based upon the ease of production, manufacturing, and profit. Quite frankly.
Now I got a question for you guys. Do you guys think that corn, wheat, and like barley and all those grains were bad for us 10, 12,000 years ago?
The poison is in the dose. That's what I think.
See, I would say no.
So
I would say that I don't think it was as bad as it is today because of all the pesticides, genetic modifications.
Okay, true. But I think also in the way that we overeat and overconsume all those things.
Well, I guess that's what I'm saying.
Without a lag period, without a long period of not having those.
So say you were living in like 1400s and you had corn maybe once a week. I would argue that
but for like what, like 3 months out of the year?
What?
3 months out of the year or something? Like 3 to whatever.
Like you got to live in that time. You're not getting the corn we have today. I would almost bet that if you compared the two, you'd probably see a huge difference between like the wheat we plant today and the wheat that was first cultivated, in 10,000 BC. And I bet you it would be completely different. But that's my opinion.
I think the different continent to continent. I think I've had many instances where I've heard that people say just like the grains or the flour that's used in Italy is different than the United States, right?
True.
People here are much more obese than they are in Italy, for sure. I mean, Italy's getting more and more obese, but still, you're seeing even just human size differences in obesity, just country to country, even because of how things are harvested. And I think, Eric, you're onto something with like the pesticides and different preservatives and how things are harvested. I think that has a lot to do with it as well.
Yeah, I think you're totally right about products, and in Italy too, especially with the wheat. I mean, they have stricter regulations on manufacturing wheat, and they allow the germ, and we also remove the husk, and we grind everything down into like a fine powder. So it reacts just like sugar in the gut anyway. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of missteps that we did in this country that sets people apart. Like, if you can look up this information about A1 cows versus A2 cows. And I don't know the history of it or anything, but we primarily in this country just consume A1 cows. Whereas if you got butter in France, it's an A2 cow, and it's actually going to have no damaging effect to the system. But A1 cow butter, or A1 cow products in general, or dairy, A1 dairy products are going to be really harsh on the system.
Is that like different species of cow? Do you know?
I guess.
Like if
I don't know. Yeah.
Like we have like white-tailed deer out here, but like out west there's like mule deer out by you and stuff. So it's like same family, but definitely different kind of animals.
Yeah, I don't know how they classified the A1 versus the A2.
Interesting.
But yeah, it had something to do with the A1 beta casein versus like the A2 beta casein. So maybe it's just the molecule, and then they're just referring to the type of cow based upon the molecule of casein it produces.
Interesting. I'll have to check that out. But I mean, I would assume we only use kind of one type of cow in this country, to like mass produce like all our dairy products.
Yeah.
And it's just,
yeah. But what's actually crazy though is, I was reading, there's a few different sources on this, but olive oil was a funny one. At first, the best ones were Spain and Italy. And then all this stuff came out about the Italian mafia siphoning out the olive oil and putting in like vegetable oils. So the best now is this company called California Olive Company.
That's what I use, baby.
Same here.
There you go. Same. As of a month.
I did my research. There was like a 2020 special on one time talked about fake olive oil industry, and it really opened up.
It's crazy.
I did a bunch of research, and I was like, okay, So I looked up, in the United States, like where were the legitimate ones, and California Olive Company was like one of the best ones. So I pay more
Yep.
for it, but I know it's
Well
worth it.
worth it. Yeah. And I think that's what it comes down to. Like you just have to um, read labels, ask questions, do your research. As much as people want to just like put on music and run through their life and not take a second to think things out, it's not that easy. You have to be awake. You have to be alert. You have to think. Haha. um, but yeah, just
And
it's crazy because it's like when you think that you've done everything right, it's like, oh wait a second, watch out, there the mafia is involved in this one. So it's just funny. There's always
there's
something.
a couple things too, so we can talk about too, which is like sugar intake for one. Um, that's a big one, and I think like what we look at when we look at like the way that food has changed. Like let's like say here's an interesting stat. So annual sugar intake of the average Englishman rose from nearly zero in the early 17th century to 18 pounds a year in the early 19th century. So over the course of, whatever, 200 years, sugar went from zero
Yeah, I
almost
mean,
to 18 pounds
we
per
did.
year
I mean,
for the average
sugar
person. That's insane when you think about it. And so when we look at like, one of the biggest like, red flags for me is all of the, child development issues. All of this sugar that is now in our diets that was not there even 17th century. So that's 1800s. What is that? Two 200 plus years ago. Just that short amount of time, we're consuming that much more sugar. Think about, and we're talking about, we're still using this like old ancient brain that hasn't changed. The chemistry of the brain is going to change dramatically when you put a chemical, and I'm calling it a chemical,
Yeah,
like
I
sugar.
can, but I don't know what happened.
Yeah. So think about like all of these things like ADD, epilepsy,
No, he's
all of
here.
these things, right, have to be a result of this massive entering of sugar, high fructose corn syrup into our diet, finding a way to refine these things to make them either more palatable or more efficient to sell, or to put things in products to make them cheaper to make. Um,
We'll think about what what sells. I mean, if I'm gonna sell you a drink, right? Do I want to sell water, or do I want to put some sugar and cocaine in it and call it Coca-Cola? And guess what? Now you're addicted. I mean, it's just it's business, it's profit, it's people making products to not necessarily be bad. I don't think they're out to harm people, but in the end of the day, now that we know the science, we're taking advantage of us as
but the,
creatures. We're very much rats in a little study, and they're
yeah,
like poking us, right? And they know that what we're going to look for. They're like, oh, they're going to go for this because this is really sugary. They're going
big
to want
issue with all
that.
this is when our government says and thinks it's okay to subsidize these huge farms and these huge companies so that they can create these products at such a low price that now our population of people who are already living in dire needs and much lower in the economical food chain, right, or the economical tree. Now that's all they can afford is this crap food, and so this vicious cycle is now happening because of it. Like, only the affluent people who live in Back Bay of Boston can shop at Whole Foods. Like, it's crazy. Like, and now Amazon came in and they're a huge company who's, I'm not saying that they're you know innocent by any means, but they've kind of helped drive down some of those prices for good quality foods at Whole Foods now. So you are seeing more people able to afford those types of things, but still, it's still a big problem when governments are putting all this money into these companies who subsidize and make these products on the cheap. And the great thing though, like I said, the pendulum has to swing back. The internet is allowing us to share information, to be able to get smarter, and understand that, there are ways for us to eat healthier. And I do think that in time that things will change and the pendulum will swing back. I don't think it's going to be, like this forever.
No, I agree. I totally agree that
I, I'm
I
I'm
think
I'm
it's
very optimistic.
overwhelming.
you know.
No, and I think that you
Yeah.
have to be. I think we should very much be, because that's what we try to do with this. Is we just try to beat the drum, and we try to wake people up, and we try to spread the word, and we try to wake other people up, and that's all we can do. I totally agree. I think it will come around because the right people are doing the right things. It's just going to take time. But I think it's important, like you said, or like we were saying before, just to read labels, ask questions. But I also think another important thing too is voting with your dollar. Like, I sure I want a good product, but I care that much more about a company when they care about me, and I will invest in that company, and I will put money towards that company because I want that company to thrive. So as crazy as it sounds, we can change little things like that by voting with our dollar. So I'm not going to be buying Cheetos every single day. I'm going to be buying like fresh local produce every day and support my local farmers and support the right companies that I want and stand behind, because I know that they take the time and effort to make a quality product and go that extra mile to make it something that's non-toxic. I mean, it's almost sickening to me when something pops up, right? Like a ghee, and then I'm looking through the aisle of all these different ghee products. I'm like, why are they putting butter in this? Why are they putting a cream in this? Why are they putting dairy in this? And it's because they're trying to make a product that tastes good that people want to keep eating. But it's like they're missing the boat. This company clearly doesn't give a shit about someone's health if they're going to make the time to make a ghee, quote unquote, but then put a bunch of bullshit in it. Or like people are going to make something that has no sugar in it, and whatever, it might be a no sugar jelly for diabetics, but all of a sudden it has xylitol and erythritol, and those might not be terrible for you, but it has a bunch of aspartame and all this other crap. So you know reading labels goes a long way. You can look into your companies a little bit further.
Yeah, Matt, you're absolutely right too.
But
Like, I just want to chime in on the local farmers and the farm
yeah,
stuff because I think you're really right with voting with your dollar in that regards. I think anybody listening, like, that's one of the best things you can do is start buying as local as you can. And for one, you look at like the local farmer, they're not, these people aren't in the business of like farming on a local level because they're trying to get rich. They're not like they're there. They got a very well intentioned existence for why they're doing what they're doing. And if you've ever stopped and talked to any of them, I've been to farm stands before. I've had them people like that at events who do farm shares, and I've talked with a lot of these farmers and people. They are really just all about spreading the word, getting people really good quality food. Like, they care more about going out and meeting the people that are eating their foods. These big companies are not. They're not interested in that. They're interested in the dollar and making more money and figuring out any way that they can do that. And yeah, they may be well intentioned. They may say, like, we've all worked for big corporations before. There are always good intentions at the top, but there's always this underlying need to drive business and make more money. And these local farmers, they're not like that. Some of them may be, but I think there are always outliers. But the general consensus of me, talking to people, it seems that these people are really well-intentioned people. They really want to just do good for the communities, get people healthier food at a decently priced rate, and and have people know where their food's coming from and that there's not all this crap in it. And I think there's something very noble about that. And so anytime you can connect yourself to somebody like that or a movement like that, I think it's really important that more of us seek those types of opportunities out, and you're going to get better food and you're going to get healthier as a as a result. So there's really no
yeah.
negative downside to it.
And it'll kind of force you to eat what's in season for your
Correct.
area, which will be best for your
Correct.
body and your
Right.
biochemistry. Yeah, I think
Cover the gamut.
we uh, I pretty much hit everything I wanted to talk about. Um, yeah, there's really. I would also recommend people check out Dr. Gundry. He has an approved food list, which is very thorough and a very good place to start if you just feel so lost and overwhelmed after this episode. Um, but um, yeah, I don't know. Do you guys have anything else you want to add before we wrap things up?
No, not really.
Big old Porter's got to get out here. I gotta get him walking.
Yeah, I mean, I
Get
just
him
look forward to
exercising.
building off of this in the weeks to come, and continuing discussion as we get into, you know, food, exercise, and just mindset, and just really diving deep into season 2.
That's right. That's right. And I think what we'll do is we'll start reading off a question and answering a question on each episode. That way, people know that we do respond to emails. So, and that's another thing too. If you do want to write in, it's thinkfitnesslife, all one word, at gmail.com. And that wraps up the State of the Food Industry, Season 2, Think Fitness Life podcast. We'll catch you next week.